Garinger was relaxing over dinner in a local restaurant. He was the team leader for a law enforcement detachment on this world, a multi-species hub. You were just as likely to see a diminutive arachnid plowcant as a massive ursoid. Garinger had served in various law enforcement positions for several years, dealing with several species, so his insights were invaluable. He also had the most amazing stories about the assorted bizarre persons and entities that he had dealt with. Aliens were so alien. Garinger was a Garinger, a species that utterly revered order and practicality. Like many other races, they had their share of intra-species conflicts to determine the final ruling class. What set them apart, though, was the realization that war didn't require pointless destruction. If you lost soldiers to gain a territory that had been razed to the ground, then those soldiers had died for nothing. The Garinger had a saying, "You cannot rule ashes." This resulted in them codifying warfare, with rules of engagement focused on preventing collateral damage and needless deaths. Of course, a few bloodthirsty despots had tried to take advantage of the warfare honor system, which had resulted in the universal policy: any who violated the agreed terms of combat would be utterly destroyed by all available Garinger, even those who had no part of the conflict. The Warfare Honor Code must be absolutely enforced by all to prevent their species from suicidal genocide. Garinger were fairly large, with hard leather skin that varied in colour from a dirty off-white to chocolate brown to deep grey. They had barrel-shaped bodies with bulky limbs. Their heads had a couple horns and tusks, with small eyes, large mouths, and huge nose-snout features. He was recounting his experiences at his previous employment assignment, a multi-species prison. There he had learned the offences that each sapient race was capable of, as well as the warning signs to watch for. He chewed a large leaf before answering the question. The main offences to look for with ursoids are fraud and theft associated with gambling losses. They are quite fond of gambling, and personal bets are so commonplace that it's integrated into their internal economy. The problems come when they gamble with other species and don't have the stabilizing customs to deal with losses. I heard of one who lost all of his businesses, then in desperation went scavenging for salvage to sell to dissidents fleeing their own government. It seems he was so destitute and desperate that he was even robbing beggars for currency, until he found one with nothing but alcohol, then thankfully gave up robbery because the beggar told him he could make more money with salvage. Giselle, a fresh-faced Garinger who had just barely achieved adulthood, was aghast. That has to be the most wretched thing I've ever heard of. Heben, another older Garinger, ground his teeth for a moment and replied, No matter how bad things are, there is one species that is guaranteed to make the situation worse. Garinger sighed and waved his head. Humans. You know how every religious species has a god devoted to trickery or warfare? It seems that all of their gods specialize in chaos. He waggled his ears for emphasis. Any time there was trouble at the prison, it usually started with a human, or at the very least they were involved in making it worse, even if it was none of their concern. They are practically suicidal in their need to cause mayhem. Heben chimed in again. I heard that they didn't evolve naturally, that an elder race was trying to uplift a species of primate to create a slave warrior race, but somehow the work went wrong and humans were the result. Fremp, a somewhat youngish Garinger with a fascination for xeno-occultism, replied excitedly. Actually, what Garinger says is probably right. It's said that their species chose dark gods and demons, and served them obsessively in exchange for power. It seems that most of their religions teach the only way to guarantee a good afterlife is by dying in battle. They were in constant intra-species warfare before leaving their cradle world. They believed they would never unify until meeting other races. That's been the one thing that has united them, having new enemies to fight. Giselle showed Fremp the back of his fists in disagreement. I know you're not serious. Next you'll be saying that these Hunams practice magic. Fremp retorted, Humans? Yes, they do, and it works. Human females are cannibal witches that will accept a lover only after making a blood sacrifice for her. I learned of this from a Denari who was captured when the humans betrayed them in their conflict with the Unla. It seems the local high priestess had 2 lovers competing for her. One of them threw the other off a cliff, then he butchered a Denari prisoner for her to eat. The other Denari were only able to escape because one of them had valuable intelligence and managed to trade it for their lives, after being forced to watch the priestess and her acolytes eat the Denari. Frem shuddered, and the other Garinger around the table had distasteful looks on their faces, while Giselle was still skeptical. Heban spoke up. I don't believe in such things, but the stories of the humans do make me wonder. During their war with the Landren, it seems the high priest there cast an invisibility spell on their warriors, so they were able to sneak up on the Landren forces on an open plain in broad daylight. The high priest cast a curse on the Landren general, so that he exploded. Now Grennick was skeptical. Exploded? Heban replied, Well, his head, but that's not even the most frightening part. The others looked alarmed as he continued. Somehow, probably dark magic, because that seems to be the only way possible, they have been turning the Jernagurv into bloodthirsty monsters like them. Some of the Garinger looked horrified, while others smirked in disbelief and showed the backs of their fists. Pobaum, who was almost as old as Grennick, actually laughed. You must be imbibing hallucinogens to believe a story like that. The Jernagurv are the most inoffensive creatures in the universe. While they eat fish, they probably just let them die of old age rather than cull them. Besides, how could anything that cute ever be malevolent? They look like a soothing toy for children. Now Grennick spoke up. Actually, that's less far-fetched than you may think. The human military has been recruiting them for intelligence and communications. One of the prisoners I had in my facility had run afoul of them right before the human-Landran conflict. It seems the human military had started experimenting with the Jernagurv soldiers, dosing them with human aggression hormones. The result was the Jernagurv were harassing local patrons at a tavern, including assault, and by the time it was all over, they had used human assault vehicles to destroy the tavern. My prisoner knew someone who was injured in the incident. Naturally, EarthGov covered it up, saying it was the Jernagurv who were assaulted and being held against their will, and that the human forces had to attack the tavern to recover their people. However, the owner of the tavern refused to cooperate with the cover-up. He rebuilt the tavern with logos and pictures, identifying the incident and guilty parties, including a large video screen showing one of the Jernagurv ramming the tavern with an assault vehicle. He wants to make sure everyone remembers what Air Force did there. Giselle looked thoughtful. I think I remembered seeing something about that. He pulled out a datapad, did some searching, then an archive news story came up, with a large lit-up sign showing a friendly-looking mammal operating some sort of mobile machine. He showed it to the others. Grennick nodded. That looks like what was described to me. Pobaum looked to the others cynically. All of you just have rumours, but what about actual encounters with them, besides the intoxicated troublemakers we see here? All I've ever actually seen of any of them is an overachieving nuisance. Pobaum leaned back in his chair. Grennick answered. Actually, I did have some encounters at the prison. Many of the humans would engage in predatory pack behavior. While they were potentially dangerous, they were also highly predictable. There were some that engaged in the pack behavior due to necessity. If they weren't part of a pack, they feared being prey. They were also highly predictable, but absolutely the most dangerous were solitary. Grennick took a long drink, then continued. Not all of the solitary humans were dangerous. Some were because they maintained their innocence and feared being associated with a pack would imply guilt. Some were solitary because they feared being victimized by the pack, or being targeted by another pack due to pack membership. These individuals were also highly predictable. But then there were the ones who were different. The others felt an apprehension. Grennick's brow started twitching, and his eyes were shifting rapidly in an instinctual survival response. Giselle broke the silence. Different how? Grennick took a bite, chewing it thoughtfully, until it was ground to a cud that he stored in his cheek. The solitary ones that liked to avoid trouble were social with each other, and too lenient guards. But these others, they were alone. Others usually avoided them out of some sort of instinct. They would go about their business, never causing trouble, but the other humans always watched them. Grennick took another bite, chewed it down to cud and stored it in the other cheek. The humans have a saying, "Watch the quiet ones." Heban spoke up. "That is the sum of their wisdom? How did their species evolve to stand upright if that's the best they can think of?" The others chuckled until seeing the look on Grennick's face. "I agreed with you, until I had that one quiet prisoner. No one understood what the humans meant until it was too late." Grennick picked through the leaves on his plate, selecting the tastier ones and eating them before continuing. "We received in a human prisoner without an identity. While unusual, this wasn't unheard of. Some humans are low-technology anarchists, preferring a nomadic lifestyle without government regulation. They believe that self-determination and privacy are the most sacred of sapient rights." Fremp was puzzled. "But what about social assistance? What happens if they lose employment or need emergency care?" Grennick replied, "They don't care. They think that social assistance is actually a trap by totalitarian authorities to keep the masses dependent and subservient." The others looked at him in disbelief. Fremp spoke slowly, trying to comprehend what he was hearing. "Do they think that if they seek medical care, that they will be incarcerated and forced into slave labor?" Grennick nibbled a few more of his tender leaves. "Yes, and also forcefully indoctrinated and possibly tortured." Pobam had been chewing a cud, but now swallowed, since it was now a liquefied pulp. "It seems to be a self-fulfilling delusion. By having such intense paranoia and avoiding necessary medical and mental health care, that is irrefutable evidence that they should be institutionalized so they can receive necessary medical and mental health care." The others were all in agreement. Grennick spoke again. "My experience with humans is that many of their personality traits are actually various mental illnesses and cognitive disorders. Fortunately, that vast majority are usually harmless, just somewhat annoying or amusing." He had eaten all of the tender leaves, so now he took a tough leaf, tore it in half, and chewed it so that only the toughest fibers were left for cud that were added to his cheeks. "Of course, I'm speaking of their general population, not criminals or military. Human children are also quite cute, like the Chunagov, but extremely inclined to get into mischief." Grennick now put the other half of the leaf into his mouth, continuing to talk as he chewed. "We had dealt with several of the low-tech anarchists before. They seemed particularly inclined to get into trouble. Fortunately, they are pretty easy to monitor because they have boisterous personalities and tend to call attention to themselves. From what I gather, successful mating among humans depends on the ability to call attention to oneself." Fremp was puzzled. "That seems extremely unreliable. Don't they have cultural regulations or genetic screening to facilitate successful mating?" Grennick answered, "In limited capacity, yes, but it appears to be optional and most don't exercise the option. They do tend to mate within their own socio-economic subculture group, but there are no restrictions for mating except acts of violence or extremely close inbreeding." Heban chuckled. "Other than technology, it seems highly doubtful that their species is fully evolved. Their chaotic behavior and haphazard breeding sounds like they are on the verge of extinction." Grennick nodded. "If they hadn't evolved in a harsh death world and needed to develop extreme hardiness, I don't think they would survive. 3/4 of their world is covered by water and uninhabitable because they are a land species, and much of the land is uninhabitable due to harsh climate, apex predators and other predators, plus other dangerous wildlife. Their world has several species with venoms, so they have become resistant. I saw a human get into an altercation with a murd. The murd stung him, but the human, while in excruciating pain, still managed to kill the murd. The human's dying words were, 'At least I took the bastard with me.' The medical specialist said that the human died not from his wounds or even from the venom, or delay in applying antivenom. It was all factors put together that killed him. If any one of the factors had been removed, the human would have survived." Giselle exclaimed, "What sort of hell could birth those monsters?" Grennick replied as he tore another leaf. "There's another trait of humans. They are bizarre. You would think that such a world would have a name that would inspire terror or be a warning. Instead, they simply call it dirt." The Garinger around the table laughed in astonishment, extending the joke. "Do they call their moon rock?" "Do they refer to the universe as empty?" "No, but close. They call it space." "Do they name their buildings stick?" "I have heard that they retain a fascination with sticks." "Dirt? Since their world is mostly water, why don't they call it wet or mud? They can't be a naturally evolved species. Obviously, they were an abandoned, unsuccessful uplifting experiment." Pobam ordered another platter of the small tender leaves from a server. They had a sweetness, with a tiny bit of tartness that made them refreshing. His physician had told him to cut back on grains and eat more fibrous leaves. He was starting to retain winter fat on his haunches well into spring. While his physician would have preferred that he eat more of the tough cut leaves, the tender leaves were a reasonable compromise. Once they settled, Grennick continued. "This new human was different than the other low-tech anarchists, because he was very contained in his behavior. He simply did as he was told and avoided calling any attention to himself. There were rumors that a few of the human packs had tried to recruit or harass him, and there were unreported injuries, but the humans would almost never report such things to others. The last I heard, that prison was looking to recruit a few human guards in the hope that human prisoners would communicate with them. But I doubt that it would have worked with this one. He avoided others, and others avoided him. Everything seemed rather mundane until exquisite prisoners began disappearing." Pobam offered Grennick a few of the tender leaves he was just served. Grennick took some and savoured them, took a long drink from his beverage, then continued. The other Garinger were now staring at him in eager apprehension. Prisoners simply disappearing? This would be worth hearing. The exquisite would disappear one at a time, within days or weeks between disappearances. At first we thought they were escaping, and tightened security at every possible exit, including resorting to physical barriers. But they still kept disappearing. We searched their quarters, workspaces, and leisure spaces, but found nothing. No sign of escape, no sign of foul play, just nothing. Until one day there was a riot. Grennick paused for a moment, starting to reach for the large, tough leaves, but now Pobam slid the platter of tender leaves to Grennick. Grennick could easily talk and chew tender leaves, but would have to pause for tough leaves. The others were at the edge of their seats, ready to order large platters of tasty flowers, if that's what it took to keep the story going. Grennick nodded in appreciation, continuing to talk and chew. Occasionally interspecies riots would happen when a pack was seeking dominance. Most other species would stay out of it, except for humans. Grennick sighed wearily and chewed for a minute. Interspecies fighting was rare, usually just a challenge for pack leadership, but humans would fight singly or in groups, and were just as likely to fight other humans as aliens. The one combat taboo they had was against aliens interfering in their intraspecies conflicts. The humans would instantly unite, beat the aliens, then resume fighting each other. Grennick went to take a drink of his beverage and frowned, seeing that there was barely a swallow left. Fremb frantically beckoned to a server to get a refill for Grennick. The server brought a new beverage, and Grennick continued after a draught. The riot didn't have a readily identifiable cause, but it did have a reason. Prisoners were working in a production area when several individuals discovered pieces of exquisite exoskeleton in materials crates. The pieces were found by Exquisite and others alike. Naturally, there was an uproar, and Exquisite were fighting everyone around them indiscriminately. It took longer than normal to contain, because somehow every lingering intraspecies conflict and resentment detonated that day. Yes, it was definitely exasperated by any nearby humans. It was as though they had a singular purpose, to spread the violence as far as possible. The others stared at Grennick with heightened anxiety. Heben croaked out what they were all thinking. Why? Grennick shook his head back and forth in a confused look. We never found out the reason, but we did discover the cause. Evidently combat stimulants were somehow smuggled into the prison, and the humans had all been dosed. All but the quiet one. The others had stopped eating and drinking entirely, not risking missing a single word of the story. Grennick carried on. The humans were easy to locate because they were so overly hostile due to the drug. Finding the quiet one was difficult, and only happened coincidentally because a machine showed a malfunction. The maintenance worker immediately consulted security when he saw fighting. We came in, and it was pure savagery. Grennick's listeners were practically shivering in dread. And? Grennick paused a moment and took a deep breath. The quiet one was sadistically dismembering a Skrizit. There were a couple of other Skrizit bodies there, freshly killed, a third who was dying and partially dismembered, and the human was using body parts of the dead Skrizits as weapons to flay the living one. We couldn't even hear the poor wretches screaming because the human had destroyed their larynxes. Normally Skrizit exoskeletons offer pretty good protection against others, but this human fought in a manner that seemed tailored to harm Skrizit mercilessly. I still smell and taste drops of Skrizit blood in occasional nightmares. The others recalled in horror. Such a story must be true, because no evolved being could invent such a thing. Grennick held his beverage in a trembling hand, took a small sip, then set it down. It took 3 of us to stop the human, when 1 is usually sufficient. He was even biting at the Skrizit as we pulled him off. The others were aghast, and a few looked nauseated. Grennick took another trembling breath. We had already gotten word from medical personnel that the humans had been doped, so we assumed it was the same with this one. But his behavior didn't fit. Instead of being in a frenzy like the others, he was savage but controlled. Once we had him contained, he immediately surrendered, unlike the others who needed to be sedated. Grennick looked at the platter of tasty leaves, then pushed it away. The gruesome memory had stolen his appetite. None of the others reached for the leaves either. We took him to the infirmary as well. As he was being cleaned and attended to, one of the Skrizit prisoners became extremely agitated, even manic. The quiet human had some sort of gold tattoo on his chest. We looked it up. Near as we were able to deduce, the tattoo was a Skrizit name. Skrizits keep slaves and are known for harsh treatment of slaves. The name was probably a former owner. Pobaum exhaled heavily. That would make sense, that he sought revenge if he had been mistreated. The others nodded in agreement, and Grennick resumed speaking. The strangest thing, though, is that the Quiet One did not have any of the drug in his system. He was clean. The others stared at him in shock. Heben asked, Perhaps it wore off and purged early. Grennick shook his head. I doubt it. As the others recovered, they were weak and vomited frequently, with severe headaches. The Quiet One had none of those symptoms. It seems he committed the atrocities in a completely rational state. A shiver swept through the listeners. He was placed in solitary confinement while the warden figured out what to do. Then, a few weeks later, human law enforcement authorities showed up with an extradition order. It seems he was wanted for capital crimes, and they were taking him to be executed. Giselle breathed a sigh of relief. Thankfully, it has been sent to be judged by its gods. Grennick showed the back of his fists in denial. I doubt it. He didn't seem aggressive or anxious as he was being taken away. Once he was gone, rumors in the prison were that the humans were quite relieved to see him go. Over the next several weeks, we found pieces of the missing Skrizits in more materials manufacturing crates. Fremp exclaimed, What a horrible tale! Grennick nodded. That's why, even though he was officially executed, I have always uploaded his profile to the local law enforcement database. He produced his datapad, and the picture with basic information was displayed. I want to be ready in case he is still alive. Fremp pointed at the human's face. What is that? Grennick looked and replied, It's a passive medical device to assist vision. Just then, an emergency alert came in. The team members were given very basic information and an order to report to Grennick for duty. Grennick sighed wearily as he read the report. It seemed that a Skrizit slave ship was having a revolt and requesting assistance from law enforcement. While slavery was legal in Garinger territory, it was very well regulated to ensure humane treatment of slaves, which prevented violence like the revolt the Skrizet were having. As Grennick verified the orders, another emergency alert came in. This was also at the shipyard, but in a different section. It seemed that several vehicles were involved in some sort of race or melee activity. Details were very conflicted, with a wide variety of vehicles and species involved. Giselle looked a little alarmed. 2 emergency calls at the same time? Grennick replied as he holstered his containment weapons. You know the old saying, it's never just a meteor, it's always a meteor shower. He squinted at the report for a moment, and grunted in irritation. Of course humans are involved.